Welcome back. I'm super excited to have you here and have the privilege of being your instructor for this amazing course on serverless. Let me start with an interesting story. A number of learners ask us what in 28 minutes means and where it comes from. I'm a great believer that if you spend 30 minutes every day taking a small step towards your dream, you will reach the top 5% of whichever career path you choose. And this belief in continuous learning is what made me choose the name in 28 minutes. And the fun fact is that I could not afford to buy the domain names in 30 minutes and in 29 minutes. And that's the reason why I had to settle for in 28 minutes. Not bad, isn't it? I'm a great believer that the best way to learn is by doing. You do not learn to drive by watching Tom Cruise drive at amazing speeds. You have to do it yourselves to learn. The same applies to learning programming and learning to develop great applications. You have to get your hands dirty. That's how you learn the most, and that's how we design our courses. So, what are you going to learn in this specific course? In the initial sections of the course, we will start with building serverless applications in AWS. We will try and understand what AWS Lambda is and how you can expose REST API using API Gateway. We will build a complete to-do REST API integrating API Gateway and AWS Lambda with DynamoDB as the database. We will deploy the front-end application to Amazon S3 and we will use Amazon Cognito for authentication and authorization. Section 3 and Section 4 of the course will help you get familiar with AWS Lambda and API Gateway. Section 6 is where we would start building our to-do REST API with Lambda functions and API Gateway. We'll be using Amazon DynamoDB as the database, and we would also integrate the REST API that we build, the serverless REST API we would build with the Angular front end. We will use Amazon Cognito for authentication and authorization. Section 6 is my favorite section of the course because here we would be integrating AWS Lambda with API Gateway. We will be using Amazon DynamoDB as the database. We'll be using Amazon S3 and we'll be using Amazon Cognito to authenticate the users. Building Lambda functions and API gateways by hand manually is a very, very tedious thing to do. And that's where we switch our attention in Section 8 and Section 9 to automation. Section 8 shows how to deploy the serverless REST API using AWS SAM, Serverless Application Model. And Section 9 focuses on doing the same thing with the serverless framework. You'd want to deploy your serverless applications to multiple environments. And that's where automation plays a key role. And that's the reason why understanding AWS SAM and serverless framework is critical. And after that, we switch our attention to Azure. We'll build our to-do REST API using Azure API Management and Azure Function App. We will use Azure Cosmos DB with MongoDB as the database. We'll also integrate the REST API with a front-end application which is deployed to Azure Blob Storage and which uses Azure Active Directory for authentication and authorization. We'll get started with understanding the basics of Azure Functions in Section 11. After that, in Section 12, we'll start with building the Azure Functions in our IDE. We'll be using Visual Studio Code as our IDE. After that, we would create our MongoDB in Azure Cosmos DB, and we would start connecting our Azure Functions to MongoDB. In Section 14 and Section 15, we would start playing with Azure API Management and integrate the REST API with our front end. Section 16 would focus on setting up authentication with Azure Active Directory. As you can see, there are a wide variety of things that you would be learning during this course. If you are new to the cloud, if you are new to AWS and Azure, some of this terminology might be really confusing. API Gateway, AWS Lambda, DynamoDB, Amazon Cognito, API Management, Function App, Azure Active Directory. There are a lot of cloud services that we would make use of in this specific course. If all this sounds Greek and Latin to you, do not worry. It's my responsibility to ensure that you understand every one of these services by the end of the course. What I would recommend you to do is to keep things simple and take things one at a time. In the next section, we would get started with what is the need for cloud and how to create your AWS account. If you already have a AWS account, I would recommend you to directly get into the section 3, which is getting started with serverless. I'm excited to have you here, and I'm sure you'll have a wonderful time learning a wide variety of things in this specific course. I'll see you in the next step. Welcome back. In this step, let's get started with what is cloud, why do we need cloud, and what is AWS. Let's get a quick introduction to all of these. Let's go a few years back and see the world before the cloud. Applications have varying load throughout the year. For example, take a online shopping application. The online shopping applications have peak usage during holidays and weekends. They have less load during rest of the time. Consider a startup. It suddenly becomes popular and there is a sudden increase in the load on the applications. The important thing for you to remember is as the load varies, the infrastructure that is needed to support the application also varies. The approach that was taken by enterprises before the cloud was to procure the infrastructure. That is, they bought the infrastructure for the peak load. So if the expected peak load of an application is, let's say, 10,000 users, then the enterprises procured infrastructure to support 10,000 users. Similarly, startups procured infrastructure assuming they would be successful. What is the problem with this approach? Let's consider the different challenges. The number one challenge is low infrastructure utilization. So let's say I'm procuring infrastructure for peak load. What would it be doing when there is less amount of load? It would just be sitting there idle, not used at all. Number two is it needs ahead of time planning. How do I know what is the peak load? Can we really guess the future? Can we really know the peak load? Number three is the high cost of procuring infrastructure. Buying infrastructure is not really cheap. In addition to this, you also need a dedicated infrastructure maintenance team. Think about a startup. Can it really afford an infrastructure maintenance team? And this is the kind of scenario where cloud started really getting popular. With the cloud, we don't really buy resources. We actually rent resources. This is called provisioning. So we provision resources when we want them and release them back to the cloud when we don't really need them. This is called on-demand resource provisioning. You rent resources based on the demand that you have on your applications. And the advantage of this is very, very clear. Lower cost because you are paying per use. You're not having to buy infrastructure, keep it idle. You just rent it, use it when you need it. An important consequence is the fact that you don't really need to do any upfront planning. You just react to the demand which is coming in. The next important advantage of the cloud is that you avoid undifferentiated heavy lifting. In the cloud, there are a lot of managed services. For example, if you want to create a database in the cloud which is highly available and highly durable, all that you need to do is to check a few boxes, create a database, and then you have a highly available and durable database. As an enterprise, you don't really need to focus on setting up a database, making sure that you have a standby setup, making sure that you have processes set up to take backups of it, because those are not the things which differentiate you from your competitor. So you can really focus on things which give you a competitive advantage. So those are the important advantages of going for the cloud. But does cloud come for free? Nope. There are challenges associated with the cloud, right? What are the challenges? The most important challenge is actually to build cloud-enabled applications. And until now, we looked at why we need the cloud. What are the advantages it offers? Now, let's look at AWS. Why AWS? AWS is the leading cloud service provider. The main competitors for AWS are Azure and Google Cloud. Among these, AWS provides the most number of services. There are 200 plus services as of now, and I'm sure by the time you watch this course, there'll be a lot more services present there. In the last decade, AWS also proved to be very reliable, very secure, and cost effective. There are a number of large enterprises which run their applications on AWS, like Netflix. We go to the cloud because it's cost effective, you can avoid upfront planning, and you can avoid undifferentiated heavy lifting. We go to AWS because it's the leading cloud service provider, providing a huge range of services which are reliable, secure, and cost effective. In the next step, Let's start with setting up our AWS account. We'll create an AWS account and we'll create a secure user to help you to make use of those accounts. I'll see you in the next step.
Welcome back. Are you excited to get onto the cloud? I am very, very excited to get you on your journey towards cloud. And the first step is to create an AWS account. You need to go to your website aws.amazon.com. To be able to create an AWS account, you'd need two things. One is your personal details, including your address. The second one is a valid debit or a credit card. Even though we are going to use free account for most part of these courses, Amazon needs your credit card or debit card details. So go ahead, have them handy and click the create an AWS account link. You can also click the create a free account, or if you don't see those buttons, you can click something on the my account as well. And you'd land up on a screen like this. Over here, you need to enter the email address that you'd want to use with your AWS account, and you'd want to give a password for your AWS account and confirm the password as well. You can also give a account name for your AWS account. So I've entered the email address, passwords, and also the account name we would want to use. Once you are done, you can go ahead and click the continue button. Once you click the continue button, you should see a contact information page. You can either create a professional account which is associated with an organization, a company, or a personal account which is associated with a person. I would choose a personal account and enter my personal details in here. You need to enter your name, your phone number, choose your country, and enter your address as well as your city, state, and your postal code. Make sure that you are giving your real details and also give a valid mobile number because Amazon would use that to verify. Once you have entered all the details, you can check this button to ensure that you are agreeing to all AWS policies. You can click that and read through and make sure that you are fine with it. You can now go ahead and click create account and continue. The next screen you would see is a payment information screen where Amazon asks you for your credit debit card details. One of the important things to understand is also the fact that Amazon will not charge you unless you exceed the free tier limits. You can get more information about what is in the free tier by clicking this link. You can also read the frequently asked questions. So go ahead, understand what you are getting into, and once you are comfortable, go ahead and enter your details in here. You'll also need to enter your billing address. Once you have entered all the details, go ahead and click the secure submit button. There might be additional screens you would see to make sure that your bank transaction goes perfectly and Amazon is able to do a transaction with your account. Once your bank transaction goes through successfully, Amazon would ask you to confirm your identity. It is done by verifying your phone number. So enter your details and click contact me. Once I click contact me, a screen with a pin would be shown to you. Amazon would call you and you need to enter whatever you see on the screen on your phone. A few times, AWS might send you a verification code and ask you to enter it on the screen. I know it's kind of boring process. The initial sign up to get onto the cloud is little boring. Amazon is giving you access to very powerful servers and they want to be really sure who you are and they have a way to reach you in case there's a problem. That's the reason why the sign up process is a little tricky. Once you're verified, you can go ahead and click the continue. We will go with a free tier plan. That's the one which we'll choose on the next screen. On the next screen, you can personalize your experience by selecting a role and also selecting an area you are interested in. I would actually close this out and click complete sign up. Now I can actually sign into the console by clicking the sign into the console in here or clicking my account and going to AWS Management Console. So I'll say sign into the console. You would be taken to a screen where you can enter your email address and enter your password and click sign in. Once you do that, you're logged into AWS. That's cool, that's great. You now have an AWS account and let's play with it a lot more in the next step. In this step, we created our AWS account. I know it was a kind of a boring process, but this is just a one-time activity that we do and it should not be a problem for us going forward. I'll see you in the next step. Until then, bye-bye. Welcome back. In the previous step, we created our AWS account. In this step, let's make our AWS account more secure. Let's learn about something called IAM, and let's learn how to create a IAM user and how to use an IAM user for all our AWS activities. When we first created our AWS account, the email ID and the password we used to create is what is called the root user. The root user can be used both for the console access as well as programmatic access to the application. The root user has complete access to everything within your AWS account. He can even close your AWS account. So it is strongly recommended not to use the root user for your day-to-day activities. Even for the administrative activities, it is better to create a different set of users called the IAM users, Identity and Access Management users. So the only thing you should be doing with your root user is to first create an IAM user and log down the credentials somewhere secure. Let's learn how to create a IAM user next. Let's get started now. I'm already logged in into the AWS console. How do we get into the AWS console? You can go to aws.amazon.com and sign into console. Since I am already logged in, it directly takes me into the account. Let's go to services and type in IAM. When I type in IAM, you would see that it says IAM and manage user access and encryption keys. I'll click this. Let's go to IAM. IAM is used to create AWS users, assign them to groups, and also assign what permissions they have. In AWS, if I want to assign a permission to a specific user, there are two ways I can do that. One is directly assign a policy to him, directly assign a permission to him. The other way is to create a group, assign the permissions to a group, assign the policy to a group, and make the user a part of that group. What we'll do now is take the second approach. We'll create a group and we'll assign a user to that specific group. So let's get started. Let's start with creating a new group. I'll call this developers. So I'll create a group called developers. Next step, I'll now need to give these developers access. So what can these developers do? How can I do that? In AWS, we have to attach policies. There are a number of predefined policies which are present in here. These are called managed policies, and these are managed by AWS. For now, I'll give all developers administrator access. You can also give them access to billing. You can, for example, AWS Lambda is one of the services, so you can give full access to AWS Lambda. What I'll do is I'll take a shortcut for now and I'll just give administrator access so they get access to everything. Now I'll say next step, and now I can create the group. Now we have a group. Now I would want to actually go back. So dashboard, we have a group. What do we need to do now? We need to create a user. How do we create a user? What we are doing in here is creating a user for our AWS account. I'll say add user. On this screen, you can enter the ID you would want for that specific user. I'll say in 28 minutes underscore dev. As you can see here, you can create multiple users at the same time with similar kind of accesses. But let's stick with one user for now. Next thing you can select is the AWS access type. Now, what is access type? Typically, whenever we talk about performing actions, there are two types of users. One is people who would want to actually log in, use the UI, and perform actions. The other kind of users might be programs. So you want to write a program to create some resource in AWS. So that's why there are two kinds of accesses which are present: programmatic access and AWS Management Console access. What we are doing now is using the AWS Management Console access. We use the AWS root account, logged in, and we are manually going through the screens and doing all the action. So what I'm doing is I'm giving AWS Management Console access to this user. So this user would be able to log in with his user ID and password and do exactly what we are doing in here. So he'll be able to log into console and perform all the actions. I'll also provide programmatic access to this user. What does programmatic access allow? For example, if you have a command line tool, AWS CLI. AWS CLI is a command line tool where you can run commands and do things with AWS. And when you want to use AWS CLI, you would want to use programmatic access. And there, this kind of access type will be really useful. We'll talk about programmatic access a little later. For now, the important thing is the fact that we are giving this user both types of access. So you can use this user credentials for logging into AWS Management Console as well as through a programmatic means. And let's use custom password. So I would want to assign a specific password. You can also use auto-generated password, but let's go with custom. And what we can also do is to have the user create a new password when he tries to sign in. For me, that's not important, so I'll uncheck that and let's click next. The next thing is to assign a group. So I'll assign a group of developers for this specific user. You can assign multiple groups. Here we have only one group, so let's assign just that. Let's not worry about tags for now. Let's go to the review screen where we can see the fact that we are creating a user called in28minutes_dev. We are providing him programmatic and AWS Management Console access, and we are assigning him to a group of developers. And let's go ahead and create user. So what you would see now is a success screen. So you would see that we have created a user successfully. Now I would want to log in with this specific user credentials. Can I go to aws.amazon.com and use that URL to sign in with IAM user credentials which we created just now? The answer is no. The important thing you need to remember is from now on, to log in into your account, into your AWS account as an IAM user, you need to use this URL. So I've taken this URL, copied it, I'll log out. So I'm signing out of my account and I'm pasting the URL which we have copied. So let's paste that in. I would go ahead and enter my user ID and password and sign in. And now you'd see that we are again logged in to our AWS Management Console. In this step, we created a IAM user and we logged in with the IAM user credentials. And from now on, we'll be using IAM user for performing all our activities with our AWS account. I'll see you in the next step.
Welcome back. Welcome to this amazing course on serverless. Before we start the course, we need to understand what serverless is. Let's get started with it right now. Now, think about this. What are the things that we think about when we develop an application? You want to develop a new application. What are the kind of things that you would think about? Some of the things that we will think about are related to deployment of the application. Where do we deploy this application? What kind of server should we make use of? What operating system should be on the server? And how do we take care of the operations related to the application? How do we scale the application? If there are 10,000 users, 100,000 users, a million users who are coming in, how do we scale the application to handle the load? And how do we ensure that the application is always available? How many instances, how many replicas of the application should I have? In addition to the architecture, the framework of the application, we also focus on how to deploy the application, how to scale the application, how to ensure that it's always available. What if we don't really need to worry about servers and focus on just building our application, just focus on our code? That's the serverless approach for me. One of the most important things that you need to remember with serverless is serverless does not mean no servers. Even with serverless applications, in the background, there are servers running. Your applications are finally running on some server of some kind. However, the important thing as far as I am concerned for serverless is the fact that you don't really need to worry about infrastructure. You'd get flexible scaling based on the number of requests coming in. The scaling is automatically done for you. You don't need to worry about whether I'll have 100 users, 1,000 users, 10,000 users. How do I scale for that? You don't need to worry about that. And automated high availability. You don't need to worry about how to make the application highly available. And the last and the most important feature is pay for use. You don't pay for provisioning servers or something like that. You pay for the number of requests that are coming in. Serverless for me is all about focusing on code. So you focus on your business logic and you leave it to the cloud managed service to take care of all that is needed to scale your applications to millions of requests. I'm sure you are all excited to learn about serverless. I'll see you in the next step. Welcome back. In this step, let's get started with Lambda, AWS Lambda. For a lot of people, serverless means AWS Lambda. That's how popular AWS Lambda is. AWS Lambda allows you to write and scale your business logic to millions of requests. You can write your business logic in a variety of languages. Node.js, that's basically JavaScript. You can write it in Java, Python, Go, C#, and a wide variety of other languages. With Lambda, as with everything related to serverless, you don't really need to worry about servers or scaling or availability. You only worry about your code. And as expected with everything serverless, Lambda is pay for use. You pay for the number of requests, you pay for the duration of the request. So if a request takes, let's say, 5 seconds, that is much more costlier than a request which takes 1 second. And you pay for memory. How much memory is your Lambda function making use of? Are you excited to learn about Lambdas? Let's get started with creating our first Lambda function in the next step. Welcome back. Are you ready to get started with your serverless journey? Let's get started with creating our first Lambda function in this specific step. I've already logged into our AWS management console. I'm using the ID in28minutes_dev, and I am inside the region North Virginia, which is US East 1. There are a wide variety of regions that are present in AWS, and US East 1 is typically the region where all the new features are typically released. That's the reason why I prefer using US East 1. You can actually use any other region which is nearer to you as well. Now, we would want to launch up the AWS Lambda service. How do we launch it up? Go to services and type in AWS Lambda. Or you can just type in Lambda. So Lambda, it's all about running code without thinking about servers. So let's click that. This would launch up the Lambda service. And you can see that right now, we don't have any Lambda functions created. What can we do to create a Lambda function? All that we need to do is to go and say create function. Over here, you can see several options. You can either author from scratch or use some of the predefined templates which are provided by AWS. What we'll choose to do is to actually create one from scratch. And if I further scroll down, you can actually give the function a name. And we will follow the convention and call this hello world. There are a wide variety of runtimes which are supported by Lambda. So if you click this drop down, you'd see that .NET, Go, Java, Node.js, Python, Ruby, and there are a wide variety of other things supported. What we would do for now is to select Node.js. Whichever latest version of Node.js you would see in there, you can select that. I'm selecting Node.js 12.x. The next thing you'd see in here is permissions. This Lambda function might need to talk to a database. So it would need permissions to access the database. The way you can provide permissions to a Lambda function is by creating something called an role. By default, the Lambda service would create a role for us. So let's not really worry about it for now. So let's go ahead and say create function. The create function would take a little while, about 30 seconds to a minute typically. Let's wait for the function to be created. Once the function is created, you would see a message saying successfully created the function hello world. And on this page, you can actually configure the code and the configuration for your Lambda function. Over here at this top of the page, you see a designer. This is where you can design when your Lambda function should be called. That's basically a trigger. So when should your Lambda function be triggered? You can configure the code for your Lambda function. you can also add a few destinations. What should happen after a Lambda function is triggered? And if you scroll down a little below, you'll also be able to see the function code. You can see that the font size is a little small. So what I would do is I'll go ahead and say font size, increase font size. So view font size, increase font size. You can also see the shortcut for it in here. So it's if you're on a different operating system, you'd see a different command. So its command is equal to on Mac, which I am using right now. So you can see the code for the Lambda function. And if you scroll further down below, you can also see all the configuration you can make for this Lambda function. Now, before we look into all that, what we'll do is we would want to test this Lambda function. How can I test the Lambda function? The way I can test this Lambda function is by first creating a test event. I can go ahead and say test, and this would launch up a screen where I can actually create a new test event. And whenever you would want to create a new test event, you can create the event based on a template. There are a wide variety of templates which are offered by Lambda service. What we'll do now is to choose the hello world, which would be selected by default, and I would call this hello world test event 1. You can see that the event contains a little bit of JSON. So this JSON is a predefined JSON which we are using. So it contains key 1 value 1, so key 2 value 2, and key 3 value 3. And we would want to send this as an input to our Lambda function. So event is nothing but a JSON which we are sending as an input into the Lambda function. We want to use this and test the Lambda function. So let's first create the event by clicking create. So now the hello world test event 1 is created, and we can use that to test the Lambda function. Let's go ahead and say test. And now you can see that execution is successful, and you can see the result of the execution in here. If you click the details tab, you can see that there is a response coming back. So this is the result from your Lambda function. There is a simple JSON which is coming back, and also you can see a summary about the execution. You can see what is the request ID of the execution, how much time it took to execute, what is the amount of duration you have billed for, how much memory you made use of, and also you can see the log that is coming out of your Lambda function. The idea behind this step was to just get you started with the Lambda function. We created a Lambda function, and then we created a test event, and we executed it, and we saw the results from the execution. In the next few steps, we would look at all the stuff you are seeing on the screen in depth. I'll see you in the next step. Welcome back. In the last step, we took the first step into the world of Lambda functions. In this step, let's explore the code of the Lambda function further. If you scroll further down and go down to the editor of the Lambda function, you can actually use this button to toggle full screen. So if you go ahead and say toggle full screen, you can see the code, and also you can see that over here you can see the result of the execution. So you can also test the Lambda function from here. So you can actually select the event and test it from here as well, and you'd be able to see the result of the execution in here. You can see the response, and also you can see the function logs directly in here. Now let's focus on the code of this specific function. By default, Lambda is using something called a async approach. If you're not familiar with JavaScript, then the async approach might be a little new to you. We'll talk about async and the other approaches which are supported by Lambda a little later. For now, the important thing for you to understand is this is where the body of the method is. This is where you write the code, and whatever is returned from this method is what is returned as the result of the Lambda function. So what we'll do is first try and understand what this specific event is. You can see that event is an argument to this specific method. Now what is contained in the event? Let's try and find that out. What I'll do is I'll say console.log event. So console.log is used to print this event to the log. Let's see what it returns. Let's format this a little so that it's very clear for you to look at. So this is the code that we have right now, console.log event. In JavaScript, you can either use a semicolon or not. Let's put a semicolon as well. Let's save this and let's test this. Once you click test, you can see the response. The response does not change. The event is printed out in here. You can see that the event is printed out in here, and you can see that it is key 1, value 1, key 2, value 2, key 3, value 3. Where is this coming from? Think about this. Do you remember where we configured this? This is where this is what we are sending as the event, the input to the Lambda function. If you want to look at the event, you can actually do a toggle in here and go back to configure test events. And over here, you can look at whatever we have configured. Now, what we would do is we'll also change the value just to make sure that seeing the change reflected. Let's change this. Let's scroll down a little and say save. Now, I would go ahead and say test again. Let's see what's printed in. Let's make this full screen. And you can see in here, value 1 changed, value 2 changed, and so on. As you can see in here, whatever input that you are passing into the Lambda function is what is the event. And you can actually access the values from the event as well. So I can say console.log event.key1. Let's save this and let's do a test. You can see that now the value 1 changed is printed in here. So event.key1 contains the value 1 changed. Because JavaScript is a dynamic language, you can actually directly access the values which are present in the event. So I can say event.key1, event.key2, event.key3. So that makes it really, really easy for us to take values from the request and try and process them. Now, that's the input. What is the output that is going out from this specific method? The output which we are sending back from this method is status code 200, and body is, we are taking a string and we are sending it as part of this specific body tag. And that's what we are seeing when we are executing it. You can see status code is 200 and body is a stringified notation of this specific thing. Because we would want to put this into a JSON, we call json.stringify and put it in there. Now, what I would do is I would actually comment this one. I don't really need to worry about the key 1 value anymore. What we'll do is we'll actually try and make this code better. A better way to do this would have been to say, let status code is equal to 200. And I can also define another variable for the body, because the body keeps changing. What I would typically do is take this and have that in here. And now I can say, let status code is status code and body, let's use body. So let's save this and let's test if this works. You can see that I'm getting the same response back. Now, the amazing thing is with JavaScript, you don't really need to do this. So over here, you can see that we are saying the key and the value is the same. So we are using the same name as the key and the content of the same variable with that name as the value. So in JavaScript, you can also do something of this kind. So status code, body, and you can say save and you can say test. You can see that the response does not really change. Now, typically, if let's say this is a REST API, I would want to return a proper response back from here. So how do we do that? Let's say I would want to return a to-do back. So I would want to return the details of a specific to-do. I would want to do something. I would want to learn something. So I would want to return that details back. How do we return that back? The way we can do that, let me close out the execution result so that you have much of the screen available. Now what I would do is I'll say let to-do is equal to and define the structure of the to-do in here. So I would say let to-do is equal to, and let's have a ID. Let's say the ID of the to-do is 100, and let's have a description. Let's say the description of the to-do is I would want to become AWS certified, let's say, and after that I can add in whether it's done or not. So is done, and let's say it's true or false. So let's say for now it's false. So I'm creating a to-do structure. Now I would want to return this thing as part of the response. The way I can do that is over here, instead of this, what I would do is I'll copy this and paste it in here. So instead of stringify hello from Lambda, what we want to do is we want to use this as the response. So JSON.stringify to do. So and say save. Let's see if we can see the to do details as part of the response. You can see that now the to do details are part of the body of the response. Now, typically whenever we talk about REST API, we have a status code of the response, we have the content, the body of the response, and in addition to that, you also have headers. You have request headers, response headers, and things like that, right? So we are sending a response back, and we want to send the headers as part of the response. How can we do that? Let's actually define headers as well. So let's close the execution result, and let's say let headers is equal to, let's define a header as well. So let's define application, actually it should be content type and application /JSON. And now I can also define headers in the response. Let's save this and let's test this. When you test it, you should see headers content type application /JSON as part of your response as well. Now, the thing you might be wondering is why are we sending a response back in this structure from the Lambda function? Over here, what we are doing is we are invoking this Lambda from our console. However, in the real world, if you want to expose this as an REST API, what we would need to do? We would need to actually create an API gateway. In AWS, you need to create an API gateway around your Lambda function so that the logic, the REST API logic in your Lambda function is exposed to the outside world as a REST API. And the API gateway actually expects the response in this specific structure. Whatever you're sending back as a status code will be the status code of your HTTP response. Whatever you are sending back as the body will be the body of the response. Whatever you are sending back as the headers would be the response headers. And that's the reason why we need to adhere to this specific response structure. In this specific step, we looked at the inputs which are coming in for this specific Lambda function, which is the event, and we looked at the output, which is the response. We saw that whatever JSON we have configured in the event is what is coming in as the input, and we can look at the details of that specific JSON. We also saw that whatever response we are sending back from the Lambda function typically needs to adhere to a structure, and we are sending it back from here. In the next step, let's explore this further. Welcome back. In the last step, we looked at one of the inputs to the Lambda function, which is event. What are the details? What are the input details that are coming in? What are the request details? The other parameter you can add into your Lambda function is something called the context. This context in here represents the execution context of the Lambda function. So this Lambda is going to execute in a specific environment, and you'd want to get the details of that context, and that's where this context variable will help us. So we can add context as the second argument to this specific function, and we can see the details of this context by doing console.log context. So let's see what are the details which are printed by the context now. Let's say test, and you can see that it says C is not defined. As we saw earlier, sometimes I was facing a problem when I actually used this save button to save the code and then do the test. It was not giving me the right results sometimes. In those kind of situations, what you can do is actually you can toggle the full screen and you can use this save button. So whatever change you need to make the change, and you can go ahead and say save from here, and you can do the test from here. So you can see the response coming back is proper. Sometimes that's giving me a little bit of an issue. So this save button is not really saving the code properly, and when I do a test, it's giving me an error. In those kind of situations, you can do this. You can minimize this, go ahead and save from here, and you can test from here. Let's go back to the full screen mode and continue our execution. So I can now see the context information being printed in here. You can see that there is a lot of information which is present in here. What I'll do is I'll copy this out. So let's try and copy this out. Yeah, this is the information which is printed in here. So this is the context information which is present in here. The important things that are present in here are function version and function name. Which version of the function are we executing? With lambdas, you can have multiple versions. We will talk about versioning a little later. You have the name of the function, how much memory is allocated to your lambda. What are the log groups? We saw that logs are being printed from our lambda. What is the log group which is being made use of? What is the log stream we are making use of? These log groups and streams are created in CloudWatch logs. We'll explore them a little later. For now, the identity is undefined because we don't have any authentication for this specific lambda function yet. You can see the unique resource identifier for the lambda function. That is, any lambda function or a database table or any resource that you create in AWS has a unique identifier. That's what you are seeing in here. And you can see the details of the request. And the interesting thing that you can see in here is also a name of a function. So get remaining time in millis shows the name of the function. A lambda function has specific amount of time to execute. The maximum amount of time a lambda function can take to execute by default is 3 seconds. And you can find out how much time is remaining. So in the execution of the lambda function, how much time is remaining? You can get that by calling this get remaining time in millis method. Now, let's try and print these details right now. So if I would want to get the function name or the log group name or the log stream name, how can I do that? Let's go back to our function and let's say I would want to print the context specific details. So console.log, the way I can do that is by saying context dot function name and save and test. Let's see if the function name is printed in here. You can see that the function name is printed in here. That's hello world. You can print other details as well. So let's say if you want to print the memory limit or the log group name, you can do that as well. So console.log, oops, let me get it right. So it should be memory limit in MB. You can also print other details if you want. Log group name, for example, I would comment the event and the context details for now so that the log is much more simpler. Let's do a save and a test. You can see the function name, the memory limit for that specific function, and the log group name printed in here. So you can use context to get the details of the execution context, the context in which your lambda function is running. Now, an interesting question you might have is how can I get the details of the function? So get remaining time in millis. So let's say I would want to get that. How can I do that? So if you would actually print this, what it would do, let's save this and test this. So what would it print? If I print the function, you can see that it's printing, it's a function. It's not printing the result of the function. If I would want to print the result of the function, what I would need to do is to invoke it. So let's save this and let's test this again. And let's see if, yep, you can see this is in milliseconds. So you have 2985 milliseconds of execution time left. By default, a lambda function can execute for 3 seconds. That's 3000 milliseconds. So at this point, when it's executing the line 8, out of the 3000 milliseconds, it has already used 15 milliseconds, and the remaining amount is available to execute the rest of the code. If you had a lot of code present beneath, then to execute that, you'd have 2985 milliseconds left. In this step, we explored the context. The lambda is executing in a specific execution context, and we saw how to get all the details of that specific execution context inside your lambda function. I'll see you in the next step. Welcome back. In this step, let's look at some of the basic settings that you can configure around your lambda function. If you scroll further down in the lambda console page, you'd see something called basic settings. These basic settings are some of the most important ones that you can configure for a lambda function. Let's look at what these are and why these are important in this specific step. The first basic setting is the description. You can give a text description for your lambda function. The next one is runtime. So over here, we are using Node.js 12x, and we saw that lambda supports a variety of other runtimes as well. The third basic setting is the handler. Over here, the handler which is present is index.handler. So how does this work? Index is the name of the module. Module is nothing but the JavaScript file. So index.js is the name of the file. So index comes from there. And why is this handler important? This handler is important because this is the name of this in here. So we are exporting the handler from here, and that's the name we are using in here as the handler. Let's try changing this and seeing what happens. So if you change this to handler 2 and save, and if you do a test, what would happen? You can see that there's an error. It says handler not found. Index.handler is undefined because in this specific module index, there is no handler with the name as handler because we have renamed it to handler 2. So I'll rename this back to handler and say save. And now you can go ahead and test this. So this would succeed. So that's the handler. The other two basic settings that you can do are memory and timeout. You can see that the default memory which is available for your Lambda function is 128 MB and the default timeout is 3 seconds. Now, if you go and edit over here, you can adjust the amount of memory that is available for your Lambda function. It can range from 128 MB to almost 3 GB. It's 3008 MB, which is less than 3 GB. So the maximum amount of memory that you can allocate for your Lambda function is just less than 3 GB. And the minimum amount of memory that you can allocate is 128 MB, which is also the default. The amount of memory that you allocate to your Lambda function is very, very important because the amount of CPU that is available for your Lambda function is also directly proportional to the amount of memory that you configured. So Lambda would allocate a CPU proportional to the memory which is configured in here. If you do a Google for Lambda pricing, you would land up on this page, AWS Lambda pricing, and you'd see that there are 3 important things that decide how much you pay for your Lambda. Number 1 is the number of requests. So how many times is your function executed? And for each of the invocations, there are 2 things that are important. One is duration. How much time is it executed for? The other important thing which is important is the amount of memory you allocate to your function. How much time it runs and the amount of memory that is allocated are the 2 important factors that decide how much you are billed for your Lambda calls. One important thing that you need to remember is the Lambda free tier includes 1 million free requests per month. Now, getting back to our basic settings page, the amount of memory can vary from 128 MB to almost 3 GB. So how do you decide how much memory you need to have for your Lambda function? The best option is to play around with it. So configure different amounts of memory for your Lambda function and see which of those gives you the optimum cost. Cost is not just dependent on the memory, but it also depends on the execution time of the Lambda function. So if the Lambda function takes 10 seconds to execute with 128 MB, but it only takes 2 seconds when you increase the memory to 256 MB, then using 256 MB is much more optimum. The other thing you can configure in here is the timeout. By default, your Lambda function is given 3 seconds to complete execution. If your Lambda function takes more than 3 seconds, then the execution is terminated and the error is returned back. The maximum timeout value is 15 minutes. So if you type in 15 in here, and you can see that it says the maximum timeout is 15 minutes. So you can go up to 15 minutes, 0 seconds. Let's go back to 03. The last setting that you would see in here is the execution role. The Lambda function needs access to be able to write logs. It needs access to be able to talk to a database and things like that. And what we can do is we can create a role, assign the role to a Lambda function, and whatever permissions that are needed, we can give to the role. Over here, when we created the Lambda function, a role was automatically created for us, and we are making use of that role. And that role has the necessary permissions that are needed for this Lambda function. If you do a cancel, and if you go to permissions, you can see the role details in here as well. You can see that this role, the name of the role is Hello World role. This role has permissions to access the CloudWatch logs. So all the logs from the Lambda function are written to something called CloudWatch logs. And this particular role has permissions to create a log group, create a log stream, and put log events into CloudWatch logs. We'll discuss this in detail when we talk about CloudWatch logs in the next step. In this step, we looked at the basic settings that you can configure for your Lambda function. We looked at the runtime, handler, the memory settings that you can configure, and the timeout that you can configure for a Lambda function. I'll see you in the next step. Welcome back. In this step, let's focus on the monitoring features that are available for your Lambda function. Once you go over to the monitoring tab, you would see two important things. One is CloudWatch metrics. The other one you would see is CloudWatch log insights. The CloudWatch metrics shows all the metrics around your Lambda invocations. You can see how many times your Lambda functions were invoked. You can see that at this specific moment, there were 4 invocations, and there were few more invocations around this particular time as well. And you can see how much time each of the invocations took and how many of them were successful, how many of them resulted in errors. You can also see how many concurrent executions happened, and also you can see the amount of requests that were throttled. When we are using Lambda service, we are only responsible for writing the code for the Lambda function. The Lambda service is responsible for auto-scaling the service to meet higher number of requests. So if I'm getting 1,000 requests, 10,000 requests, then I would have a lot of concurrent executions happening. You can also configure a limit on the concurrent executions. So if I would say maximum of 100 concurrent executions and there are more requests in parallel than that, then those requests will be throttled. So you can see metrics around all those things in the CloudWatch metrics. And the other thing you can see in here are CloudWatch log insights. So over here, you can see the details of your recent Lambda invocations and also the costliest Lambda invocations. For each of the invocations, you can see the timestamp, the request ID, you can see the log, where is the log for that present, and you can see the duration of the execution. You can see that this specific thing took about 38 milliseconds, and you can see all the details around it in here. You can also see the most expensive invocation. So in the last period of time, so over here we are looking at 3 hours of data. So in the last 3 hours, which are the most expensive requests? So you can also look at them. So you can change it to 1 hour and look at the most expensive invocations in the last 1 hour. So you can go to the monitoring page of the Lambda function and monitor the invocations and also the logs for that specific Lambda function. The other option you have is also to directly go to CloudWatch and look at the logs. So you can say view logs in CloudWatch, and you can go in here and you can pick up the latest stream and you can look at the logs for it. So you can see that all the logs, you can check them out in CloudWatch as well. So you can see that all the requests are being logged in here. So CloudWatch enables you to look at the metrics, and also it allows you to look at the logs. The other important AWS service from the monitoring perspective is something called X-Ray. So if you click view traces in X-Ray right now, you'd see that there are no traces for the hello world method. Why are there no traces? Let's wait for the page to load. You can see that right now there are no matching traces. Why are there no matching traces? That's because we need to enable X-Ray. So if I go back to configuration and go to the monitoring tools. So if you scroll down, you would see monitoring tools. You can see that logs and metrics are enabled by default. However, tracing is not enabled. So you can go to edit and say active tracing and say save. Before you save it, it's very, very important to understand X-Ray pricing. As you can see in here, AWS X-Ray offers a perpetual free tier. So the first 100,000 traces recorded are free. And beyond the first 100,000 traces, every 1 million traces costs you $5. You can also see that there are charges for searching these traces. The first million traces retrieved or scanned are free. However, more than that, you need to pay for it as well. Now, I'll go ahead and enable this. So I'll say save. So we are activating the tracing, and let's do a few tests. So I'll call this function a few times. And now I would go to monitoring and click this view traces in X-Ray. Let's see if there are any traces right now. You can see that there are a few traces present. So there are 3 traces which are present. If you don't see the traces, wait for a couple of minutes and you should see the traces appear. You can see for each of these, the response, the execution time, and also you can see the other details of it. Let's choose one of these traces and wait for the map to be loaded. And you can see that we have executed one request. This is the Lambda environment, and that invoked the hello world function. So you can see the entire trace in here. If this Lambda called multiple Lambda functions, then you can see all of them in here as well. So you can see the complete tracing information in here. You can see that the initialization of the Lambda function took about 136 milliseconds and the invocation took 7 milliseconds. This specific request took a long time. It took about 258 milliseconds. So you can see the details around that in X-ray. Let's close this. In this quick step, we looked at all the monitoring features around Lambda functions. We saw that we can use CloudWatch to look at the metrics for our Lambda functions and also look at the logs. We saw that we can use X-ray to trace a specific Lambda invocation. I'll see you in the next step. Welcome back. In the last step, we looked at monitoring of our Lambda functions. And in this step, let's look at versioning. Versioning is a very, very important feature when it comes to REST API. You would want to have multiple versions of your REST API. Behind your REST API, we will have Lambda functions. And therefore, you would also want to be able to version your Lambda functions. How can I create different versions of my Lambda functions? Let's look at that in this specific step. What we'll do is we'll go to Actions and we'll say Publish New Version. That's how you can create a new version. And over here, the version description is optional. You can go ahead and say Publish. You can see that for me, a Hello World 5 is created. I had a few problems earlier, due to which I had to delete 2, 3, 4 versions. And that's the reason why the newest version is being created as version 5. For you, if you are actually creating this version for the first time, then you should see a version 1 in here. Once you create a version, you can use that specific version and test it as well. So I'm testing version 5. You'd see that it returns the response as it is in here. The important thing is once you created a version, you'll not be able to edit the code of it. So you cannot go in here and say, become AWS certified something else. So you'll not be able to edit this code. You can see that code and handler editing is only available for the latest version. So if you want to edit, you have to either go to latest from here, or you can go to version and select latest. You can go to the latest version. You can edit it. Over here, you can go in and say V6, let's say, and say save. And then you can execute it. You can see that it is executing the latest version of it. Oops. It says V in here and 6 is missing. Let's make sure that I add 6 in here. Oops, the 6 is in here. So V6, save, and test again. Let's see if V6 is in here. Yep, the V6 is in here. So that's cool. So we have another version present. So what we can do is now publish that version as well. Publish new version and say publish. So you can see that I can choose this specific version and test it. So if I call version 6 and test it, you'd see that the execution result will have V6. And if I choose version 5 and wait for it to load up and test it, you can see that there is no V6 in here. So this is how you can actually create multiple versions of your Lambda functions. As you can see, it is very, very easy. The important thing that you need to remember is that only the latest version of the Lambda function can be edited. All these 5 and 6, and for you it might be 1 and 2. These versions are read only. These versions are execute only. You can execute those versions, but you cannot edit them. If you want to edit, you have to go to the latest version and edit that particular version. In addition to versioning, Lambda also provides a feature called aliases. Let's say you have a Lambda function and you are exposing a REST API around your Lambda function. How do we expose a REST API around the Lambda functions? Typically, you would create an API gateway. So let's say we have a QA installation and a production installation other than our development. Let's say the development is using the latest version always. And let's say right now we have just one version which is released, V1. The QA API gateway is pointing to V1 and the production API gateway is also pointing to V1. Let's say right now we have completed development and we have released V2. And I would want to switch the QA API gateway to V2. What I would need to do is I would need to go to the API gateway and make the change to point it to the V2 version of the Lambda function. Let's say it's all tested, everything is fine, and we are ready to go to production. what I would need to do next is go to here and change it to v2. And let's say now there is a v3 coming in. So there is a new Lambda version that we have developed and we would want to test that. So you would need to update QA to v3, test it, and slowly we would go ahead and then update the production version to v3. Whenever we change the Lambda, what we need to do is to release the new version of the Lambda and update the API gateway. So we need to update the API gateway to point to the newest version of the Lambda. This API gateway could be any consumer of the Lambda function. So it's not just the API gateway, but you might have other programs which might be talking to your Lambda functions. So all of them need to be updated with the latest version of the Lambda. How can I prevent updating the version of the Lambda each time? One of the ways you can do that is by actually creating an alias. So if I create an alias QA, this alias is actually part of the Lambda service itself. So I can point the QA alias to point to v3, and I can point the prod alias also to point to v3. So what we can do is the QA API gateway, we can start using QA alias, and the prod API gateway can use the prod alias. And after that, when I release a v4, all that I need to do is I don't need to change the API gateway because the API gateway is now pointing to aliases. So we don't really need to update the API gateway. All that we need to do whenever we release a new version of the Lambda function is to update the alias, which is already part of the Lambda service. So as part of your Lambda service, you have the alias. So you need to go and update the alias to v4. Now your QA would be pointing to v4, and you can actually go ahead and test your QA environment, make sure everything is fine. And once it's fine, you can actually go ahead and also update your production alias to point to v4. So if you create an alias for each of your consumer and their environments, you can manage which version should be pointed to from each of your consumers. So what we can do is we can say actions, we can say create alias, and I can create an alias saying dev, and you can point it to a specific version. So I can say dev points to version latest. So always dev is using the latest version. Whichever is the latest version is what is pointed out by dev. You can also create other aliases. Let's say I would want to have an alias prod, which is pointing to v5. So v5, let's say, is the stable version, and I would want to have that in production. You can see that over here now we can use either the alias or the version. So you can either invoke a specific version or you can use a specific alias. So if I use, let's say, dev, and if we do a test, what would be the output? The output would be whatever is the latest. So right now it's v6. Let's update that to v7. Over here you can see that we cannot update the code directly in here. What we need to do is to go to the specific version, which is latest. So let's go to the latest version. Let's update the code in here to v7 or whichever version you'd want. Let's save that, and let's go over here, go to the alias, and let's go to dev, and let's test it. You can see that it prints v7. So if anybody is using our alias dev and executing this Lambda function, they would get the response back as v7. However, if somebody is using prod and they do a test, they would get the output as the older version. So it does not have v7 in here. So it says become AWS certified. Let's say I've tested the version 6 completely and it's ready to move to production. I would want all the production consumers to use v6. All that I need to do is to change the alias in production to use v6. How can we do that? The way you can do that is just go down. So I'm inside the production alias right now. I can go in here, say edit, and change the version down to v6 and say save. So now the production alias is pointing to the v6 of the service, and if you would execute it, you'd see it's pointing to v6. So in this specific step, we looked at versioning and aliases. Versioning helps you to create multiple versions of the services. If you use aliases, then you'd not need to keep updating your consumers whenever you make a change in the version of your Lambda functions. So you're trying to decouple the consumers from the specific version of your Lambda function. I'll see you in the next step. Welcome back. One of the most important things that we talked about related to lambdas and serverless is the fact that you don't really need to worry about scaling your application, scaling your lambda functions. If there are 1,000 requests, lambda would automatically handle that for you. Now, how does that happen? Let's get a sneak peek into that in this specific step. Typically, when we talk about lambda functions, we also talk about function concurrency. Concurrency is nothing but number of lambda function instances serving requests at a given point in time. So if I have a function A, and let's say there are 15 instances serving requests at that specific point in time, then the function concurrency for that specific function is 15. Now, how does this concurrency happen? What does lambda do? Let's consider a couple of scenarios. Let's take the first scenario, which is to invoke a lambda function for the first time. You just created a lambda function and you are invoking it for the first time. What happens in the background? In the background, AWS Lambda creates an instance for that specific function. This is also called an execution context. So it creates an execution context for your function. Once an instance is created, AWS Lambda calls the functions handler method. So we have defined the handler method for Lambda in the previous step. So it would call the handler method and it would return the response. So basically it processes the request and returns the response. Once it completes handling the request, AWS Lambda does not terminate the function instance. What it does is it keeps the function instance active. The function instance stays active and waits to process new events. Let's say the execution is complete, this request is completely processed, and there is another request which comes into this Lambda function. What happens? AWS Lambda will make use of the function instance which was already created. Now let's consider another scenario. You invoke the Lambda function again while the first event is in progress. This event is in progress, it's being handled, and at that particular point in time, you call the Lambda function again. What would happen? AWS Lambda creates another execution context, another instance for the function. So it creates another instance of the function, and that instance would handle the request. So as the number of requests coming in increase, the number of Lambda function instances also increase proportionately. The other important thing to remember is when the number of requests decreases, Lambda stops unused instances. What does this mean? Whenever there are a lot of instances present and there are not sufficient amount of requests, then Lambda would stop some of the unused instances. What we are talking about is the fact that as the number of requests increase and decrease, the Lambda function instances are increased or decreased to adjust to the load automatically. This is done automatically by your AWS Lambda service. However, the important thing to remember is that there are limits to the concurrency of a Lambda function. Where do we configure the limits to concurrency of a Lambda function? Let's go over to our Lambda function, and if you scroll down, there is a section of configuration called concurrency. This is where we can configure the concurrency for a function. By default, if you don't really configure anything, the function concurrency makes use of unreserved account concurrency. What is this unreserved account concurrency? Basically, unreserved account concurrency is the maximum of concurrent Lambda instances that can be processing requests across your account. So by default, you can have in your specific account, if there are 10 Lambda functions, across all these 10 Lambda functions, you can have a maximum of 1,000 concurrent invocations. That is what is called unreserved account concurrency. You can actually raise a support request if you want to increase this further from 1,000. And from this 1,000, you can actually reserve some of these for your function. By default, this limit 1,000 is across all the Lambda functions. But if, let's say you'd want to reserve it for a specific function, you can configure that in here. So you can say edit, and over here you can say reserve concurrency. So out of the 1,000, I would want to allocate 100 for this specific function. And for all the other functions, you can configure up to 900 by default. So let's do a cancel in here. So that's basically the limits on concurrency. One more important configuration with respect to concurrency is called provisioned concurrency. Why is provisioned concurrency important? Because of fluctuations in latency. Why is there a fluctuation in latency? Because the instantiation of a Lambda function takes a lot of time. Let's say I'm calling a Lambda function. There are two possibilities, right? I might be creating an instance and then handling the request using that instance which is newly created. Or there might be a free existing instance which I'm making use of to run the Lambda function. Based on whether a new instance is created or not, the response time of a Lambda function might vary. And that's the reason why there is fluctuation in latency. How can we avoid fluctuation in latency? What we can do is to provision concurrency. We can say, irrespective of the load, I would always want to have 20 Lambda function instances always running. And the place where you can configure provision concurrency is right below the function concurrency. So you can go in here and say add, and you can configure a provision concurrency. You can say this specific alias and this specific provision concurrency. But the important thing you need to remember is provision concurrency is much more expensive. In this quick step, we got a quick overview of concurrency of the Lambda function. We talked about the fact that when there are no instances available to process a new request which is coming in, AWS Lambda would create a new function instance. This would mean that a lot of concurrent Lambda function instances would be executing requests in parallel. With Lambda functions, all that we focus on is the code. AWS Lambda would take care of scaling up and scaling down the number of instances based on the load. We also saw a couple of important configurations related to concurrency. We talked about function concurrency, we talked about account reserved concurrency, and we also talked about provisioned concurrency. I'll see you in the next step. Welcome back. In the previous few steps, we were playing around with Lambda functions. Now we would want to expose a REST API around our Lambda function. How do we do that? We would need an API gateway. In this step, let's get introduced to API gateway and all the features that an API gateway would provide for us. Most applications today are built around REST API. You have a set of resources to do a specific to do or accounts, orders. So you have a set of resources and you have a set of actions that you would want to perform with these resources. You would want to delete a to do, update a to do. You want to create a new to do. So all these actions are modeled using REST API these days. Typically, you would use the HTTP methods like get, put, post, delete, and perform an action against that specific resource. So most applications today are built around REST API. And managing your REST API is not really easy. Why? Because you need to take care of authentication and authorization. You need to be able to do things like rate limiting, quotas. Customer 1 can only invoke this request 100 times. Customer 2 can invoke this 10,000 times. That is what is called rate limiting and creating quotas. You'll also want to be able to take care of versioning your API. You might have 2 or 3 versions of your API live at the same time. And you'd want to implement monitoring, caching, documentation, and a lot of other features for your REST API. So if managing a REST API is not really easy, what is the way out? How about a fully managed service with auto-scaling that can act as a front door to your APIs? That's where API Gateway comes into picture. An API Gateway helps you to publish, maintain, monitor, and secure APIs at any scale. An API Gateway integrates with Lambda functions or any other web application. So if you have a HTTP URL, that's more than sufficient. You can expose an API around that using an API Gateway. API Gateway supports both HTTP and also WebSockets. In HTTP, we know we send a request and we get a response back. There is no persistent connection between the server and the client in HTTP. However, WebSockets is all about two-way continuous communication. You have a persistent connection between the client and the server. Your API Gateway supports both of these. So it supports building your REST API using HTTP and also it supports WebSockets. And as you would easily guess, API Gateway is serverless in the sense that you don't really need to provision servers to deploy your API gateway. AWS would take care of that, and you would pay for the number of API calls and the duration of those requests. In this quick video, we got a high-level overview of what is an API gateway. I'll see you in the next step.